on a fantastic journey to look for the origins of life. I shall be travelling not only around the world, but back in time to try and build a picture of what life was like in that very early period.
It will be a journey full of wonders. Parts of it were unknown until only a few years ago. In 50 years of program making, I've been lucky enough to explore the living world in all its splendour and complexity. Now I'm off to explore the origins of all this, to look for the very first living creatures that appeared on the planet. In recent years, scientists have unearthed dramatic evidence of what those first creatures were like. We can also find clues in living animals. From the moment they appeared to the time that they took their pioneering steps on land, we can deduce how animals acquired bodies that moved, eyes that saw, and mouths that ate. And we can understand how those first organisms laid the foundations for modern animals as we know them today.
Hello, old boy. How are you?
Including you and me. The history of life can be thought of as a many-branched tree, with all species alive today related to common ancestors down near the base. The 5 kingdoms of life, the main branches, were established early on. Bacteria, protists, amoeba-like creatures, fungi, plants, and animals. That, for me, is the most fascinating question of all. How and when did they first appear? Chania was a marine organism, part of an ancient community of living things that lived in darkness at the bottom of an ocean. That much we do know. But what was this strange creature? When did it first appear? And how is it related to modern animals? The answers to these questions are only now beginning to emerge. Chania is more than 8 times older than the oldest dinosaur. It lived about 560 million years ago. But compared with the age of life itself, that's nothing. Before Chania and other complex organisms existed, the only living things were microscopic single cells. They first appeared about 3.5 billion years ago, when the Earth was a very different place. The early continents were still forming. The days were a mere 6 hours long, because at that time the Earth was spinning much faster on its axis than it does today. The land was dominated by volcanoes, hostile and lifeless. But deep in the oceans, life had begun. The latest theory is that chemicals spewing from underwater volcanic vents solidified and created towers like these, and this produced the conditions needed for the first cells to form. Some of these began to harness the energy of sunlight, just as plants do today, and formed colonies. These rocky stromatolites in Western Australia have been constructed by very similar photosynthesizing bacteria. Others managed to survive by extracting nourishment directly from the environment, like the fungi. and animals that would later evolve. This state of affairs continued for a vast period of time. Fragments of red stone are embedded in the darker rock. They look out of place, and in fact they are. Geologists call them drop stones. They were transported here by glaciers. Life was nearly annihilated before it had truly begun.
It's difficult to imagine how life managed to survive in those circumstances. But survive it did. As the glaciers retreated, so nutrient-rich meltwater flooded into the oceans.
For the surviving cells, this flood of ground-up rock was a bonanza. For the microbes that could photosynthesize, the pulverized rock was a potent fertilizer. And their growth would have a direct influence on early animal cells.
Cyanobacteria and other oxygen-producing microbes began to bloom across the globe.
These flourished in colonies of plant-like microbes that pumped out enormous volumes of oxygen. And it was this increase in oxygen that was the key to the rise of the animal kingdom.
Now, simple microscopic life had the fuel it needed to develop into something bigger.
The fossils in these rocks are both wonderful and bizarre. When the sun is low in the sky, the slanting light shows up their structure in great detail. Organisms were no longer just clumps of undifferentiated cells like sponges. They were organized into defined shapes. Here, there are not only hundreds of examples of Charnia, but a whole community of other strange creatures.
Everywhere you look, there are complex markings and indentations of one kind or another. It's almost as though children have been playing in wet sand. It's like walking through a carpet of ancient creatures. It's difficult to imagine that 565 million years ago, this was the bottom of the ocean, and these were some of the first animals to live on this planet.
And then, over hundreds of millions of years, mountain-building forces thrust the whole seafloor upwards to its present position on the coast of Canada. Dr. Guy Narbonne is a world expert on the fossils of Mistaken Point. This new mobility was only made possible by a major change in the layout of animals' bodies.
When we get to Ediacara, we still have some of those beautiful fractal-like forms that you see in Mistaken Point. But in the Ediacara Hills, we see something very different. And that is, for the first time, you see a blueprint for all animals from then on, including ourselves.
So now this is something you'd like to...
The modern animal body plan is called bilateral symmetry, that had developed in this way. It had a head and a tail, and so it moved in a particular direction.
It's quite likely that they had sensory organs concentrated in the head. This head demonstrates that sensory capacity had evolved.
It was able to sense where food was likely to be on the seafloor, and therefore clearly had a mechanism for actually moving towards that food.
Bilateral animals like Sprigina had another advantage. Between the head and the tail, there are numerous segments. So these animals could increase in size by simply adding more segments. What is more, each segment could do a particular job.
Once you start to move, you develop a front end, and that becomes your head. And you also, by definition, have a back end, and in between, segments on which you can add appendages. On that basic pattern, you can add further features. On the front end, that's where you need sense organs, eyes, feelers. On the appendages, you can modify them to be hooks and claws, which help you catch things. And at the back end, there will be a paw from which you excrete the waste products. And that is the basic body plan of almost all the animals that are alive on Earth today.
It had taken 3,000 million years for multicellular organisms to appear for the first time. But now, less than 100 million years later, an evolutionary blink of an eye, animals had appeared that had the same basic body plan as most that live today. They had heads and tails and segmented bodies, and they were able to move to find food. How was it that animals had suddenly become so complex? The Ediacara Hills may hold the evidence for an answer to that question.
Living organisms don't live forever. If a species is to survive, it has to reproduce. And the first simple animals did that very simply, by straightforwardly dividing. But if a species is to survive, it also has to have the ability to change with the changing environment. And to do that involves reproducing in a rather different way. Evidence of how that happened can also